All right. Open up your Bibles tonight to 1 Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. Samuel 17, of course, is the account that we have in Scripture of the Battle of Elah, which was started out as basically just a battle between two men, and we'll get to that in just a moment. We laid out kind of the principal characters and the setting of the Battle of Elah. Here is a map of the Valley of Elah, the Battle of the Valley of Elah. Elah is a valley that runs through central Israel. It's in the northern territory of Judah. Now, Judah is in the south, but it runs through the northern part of the Judean territory, and it runs east to west. In the Valley of Elah, it runs, you see right here is how it runs. Over here would be Bethlehem, and over here would be Gath, which is in Philistia. So it runs east to west from Gath to Bethlehem. And I mentioned, it's kind of interesting because David was from Bethlehem and Goliath was Goliath of Gath. So it's kind of a war between the opposing sides of the Valley of Elah to begin with. The Philistines, they pitched on the southwest side. Now this valley, a lot of times valleys, they go down and they're very kind of pointed in the bottom because you have two mountains that are coming together. That's not how the Valley of Elah is. The Valley of Elah, you have the Philistines here on the southwestern corner or side, rim, if you will, and then the Israelite position on the northeastern side. And they're on the slopes that lead down into the flat valley. The Valley of Elah is a very flat place. Here is the Philistine position. So this is looking at the Philistine position. So right here would be the end of their line, and the Philistines would have been on these hills stretching across your screen here, and you can see how it's flat there between. That's what it would look like if you're standing there and you're looking at the Philistine lines. That's where they start. They start from Shoko and they go to Azekah. That little, you see the hill that I mentioned, right here is Shoko. So that's where it stretches from, the Philistine lines. Here is the northern valley rim, which would be the Israelite position. And you see right here, these cliffs, you see where it's kind of been chipped away? Those cliffs are about 30 meters high from here up to here. And so those cliffs weren't there in the days of David. They have since kind of quarried out this hill a little bit to use for stone. So the children of Israel, the armies of Saul, would have been on hills that descended down. And again, you can see the flat bottom of the valley stretching across. And it's out of this valley and into this valley that the Philistine champion, Goliath of Gath, came and issued a challenge to single combat to determine the outcome of the conflict. And you can read that in verses 8 through 10. Now, Goliath, we mentioned last week, he stands 9 foot 9 inches tall. So he's a big guy. I would be looking him just about in the belt buckle if he and I were to get into it. And we mentioned he's not a tall, spindly 9 foot 9. He's built pretty good. The man's jacket, his coat of mail that he wore weighed 150 some pounds. So imagine going into battle with, that's just kind of your base coat, okay? And then he had, the Bible says he had a helmet of brass on his head, and he had greaves of brass on his legs, and he had a target, kind of a rear breastplate that he had on his back. And then he went in, and his staff was like a weaver's beam, which would be 2.5 inches, a 2.5-inch beam that he carried, and it had a great big 12-pound spearhead on it. And then somebody, I mentioned probably the low guy on the totem pole in the Philistine army, had to carry the man's shield into battle with him. And so Goliath would have been a powerful force to be reckoned with. You wouldn't want to go out into battle with him because it wouldn't take a whole lot for him. I mean, if the man fell on you, he wouldn't do you any favors, right? The most likely champion, though, to go out for Israel against the Philistine champion Goliath would be the tallest Israelite, right? Which was Saul. Saul, we're told in 1 Samuel 9, verse 2, that he was head and shoulders above everybody else. So it just makes sense that if we've got to figure out some sort of a champion, let's let it be our king who we wanted to lead us into battle. But of course, Saul and his men hid themselves in fear. They refused to answer Goliath's challenge, and they refused to move against the Philistine lines. And I mentioned this a little bit last week. Militarily speaking, you don't want to give up high ground, and you don't want to attack an elevated position, which is what either side, whoever moves first in the Valley of Elah, is going to be giving up high ground and attacking a fortified and elevated position. So you're going to be fighting uphill. So both sides are kind of locked in a stalemate, and Goliath is down in the valley where for 40 days he calls out the same challenge, where he's asking for them to send out a man, and let's decide this. If I win, then you'll be our servants. If he wins, which would be a highly unlikely scenario, if he wins, we'll be your servants. Now, in verse 12, just by way of review again, David is asked by his father, Jesse, to go to his 3 eldest brothers who were in Saul's army. He's supposed to go and check on them. He's to take bread and corn and cheese. The corn very likely would have been parched grain, not necessarily eared corn as we think of. And when David arrived to check on his brothers, he found them in verse 23, and as he talked with them, behold, there came up the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, out of the armies of the Philistines, and spake according to the same words. And David heard them. So there's the difference. The speech that he made was the same speech he'd been given for 40 days. The difference is David heard him this time. And we see Israel's response in verse 24. It says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, speaking of when they saw Goliath, a mountain of a man, they fled from him and were sore afraid. With good reason, right? If you saw somebody who was 9 foot 9 inches tall and carrying all of this hardware that Goliath was, you'd probably run too. In verse 21, Israel had been preparing, kind of rallying their forces to go into battle. But when Goliath walks out and starts hollering, their rally turned into a rout, and they've all run, and they're hiding. Can you imagine trying to hide an army? I mean, you saw the picture. There's not that much to hide behind, honestly. Certainly not an army. And they're hiding from Goliath for fear that somebody will get voluntold, perhaps. They don't want Goliath to say, you, come on down here. That's not what they want. And so they're all hiding. And when they got to their hiding place, the men of Israel begin talking amongst themselves. And we catch up with them in verse 25. And the men of Israel, the same ones who had just run, so imagine, they're hiding behind rocks. And they're hiding behind trees. And they're in their tents, and they're cowering for fear. And the men of Israel said, have ye seen this man that's come up? Surely to defy Israel is he come up. And it shall be that the man who killeth him, the king will enrich him with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and make his father's house free in Israel. So they're hiding, talking about how big and scary Goliath is, and then somebody says, you hear what you get if you kill him? Whoever goes up and fights him, they'll get the great riches. The king will enrich him with great riches, kind of a monetary bounty. We don't know how much. They get the king's daughter. This was not unusual, by the way, to offer a daughter, a king, to do this. If you remember in Joshua chapter 15, Caleb offered his daughter to whoever could come up and defeat the giants in his land. It's interesting. The same giants that would have been Goliath's forefathers, the sons of Anak, they were there in Caleb's land, and he offered his daughter's hand in marriage to the man who could defeat the giants, kick him out of his land. And so you remember who it was? Here's some real trivial pursuit for you. It's the first judge. His name Sounds like oatmeal, you remember?
Oh,
Othniel. Othniel was the first judge. He's the guy who came up, and he was the one who defeated the giants on Caleb's land and got the hand of his daughter, whose name was Axel. But this was not just the chance to marry the king's daughter. It was also a chance for some pretty dramatic social improvement. You go to being the king's son-in-law. Now you're in the king's family, which would likely mean prestige, perhaps position, and more power would come to you. So the man who kills Goliath, he gets the bounty, whatever that is. He gets the hand of the king's daughter in marriage, which not only the daughter, but also the advancement that goes with it. And his father's house is free in Israel. Means that his father's house is made exempt from all taxation. You'd say, well, that's no big deal. To not have a family have to pay taxes. How many brothers did David have? Seven brothers. None of them had to pay taxes either, because they were all of the father's house. A father's house being free of taxation could be 80 to 100 people, would be considered the family unit of a father's house in this day. It's a big deal. It's a real big deal. And so this is what the men of Israel are talking about as they're hiding. Okay, they're looking over a rock and saying, I hear we get lots of money, and you get the king's daughter, and you don't have to pay taxes. Back under the rock. Okay, they're scared, again, with reason. Verse 26. And David spake to the men that stood by him, saying, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Now, as I'm reading this, I would just have to assume that maybe David wasn't close enough to hear what they just said in verse 25. Because if he was listening, they just told him, right? What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him after this manner, saying, So shall it be done to the man that killeth him. So, again, maybe he's not close enough to hear. But David's line of question is a little bit different, and I think it's important. He says, first off, What shall be done to the man that killeth this Philistine, and taketh away the reproach from Israel? Goliath's taunt is a national embarrassment. And I think this is a good example of biblical patriotism right here. As David looks down there and he hears this Philistine, he says this uncircumcised Philistine, he says, listen to this guy down there, and he's defying the armies of Israel. And there's some patriotic fervor, I think, that kind of begins to get stirred in him. Then he says, Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? So, every moment that Goliath spent drawing breath is an opportunity for him to continue defying the one true God of Israel. And David is not willing to sit idly by and listen to this man run down his country. That rubs him the wrong way. But the fact that he's defying my God is a much bigger deal. No, you don't talk about my God like that. And David takes it personally. Everybody should have taken it personally. Their patriotism should have, but also their spiritual, because David's issue wasn't just patriotic, it was spiritual. Goliath is a heathen idolater, claiming that he's sufficient to destroy the very best that Israel has to offer. And David knows beyond any doubt that God is able to shut Goliath up. So who's going to be the volunteer? Is essentially what he's doing. David hears Goliath, and he looks around. Everybody else is looking around. They're saying, I'm not going. You going? No, I'm not going. And David looks around, and he says, So, is there a line here that who all is going? This should be everybody's on board to go down here and fight this man. Well, you remember why David went to see, why he went there? Well, he went to see his brothers. Well, his brother shows up in verse 28. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spake unto the men. Eliab, his older brother, heard him saying, So who's going to go? Who's going to go? Who's going to go knock this guy out? Who's going to go shut this guy out? He's not allowed to sit down there and run down our God. And Eliab overhears it, and Eliab takes issue. his brother heard when he spake unto the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. And he said, Why camest thou down hither? And with whom leftest thou those few sheep in the wilderness? I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Now, we were introduced to Eliab in chapter 16. He's the oldest, obviously. And when Samuel first saw Eliab, he was there to anoint the next king of Israel. And what did Samuel think when he saw this tall, dark, handsome, rugged young individualist walk into the home of his father? He thought, this is king material right here. This is it. And God told him that famously, look not on the outward appearance, because God looks on the heart. So Eliab wasn't God's choice for king, and here we kind of find out maybe why. Why would Eliab try to belittle David from making public statements like he was? Think with me. Let's put yourself there just a little bit. Why would Eliab try to run down his little brother who's talking like this? Jealousy. Made him look bad, you think? Here Eliab, this specimen of masculinity, is hiding behind a rock, and his little brother's out there calling down Goliath. In an effort to belittle David, to make himself feel better about his own cowardice, Eliab begins to challenge his little brother. And he asks some questions. So I'm going to ask the questions, and you give me the answer, because we've already gone over it. He says, Eliab says to David, Why camest thou down thither? Dad sent me. Okay, so I'm obeying Dad. Good answer, right? Obedience. He says, With whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? He saw to their care, right? Verse 20 says that he left them with a keeper. So he's got a good answer. Why are you here? Dad sent me. Where'd you leave the sheep? Well, they're with their manager. They're with the person who I hired to take care of them. Then Eliab, he levels some accusations. I know thy pride and the naughtiness of thine heart, for thou art come down that thou mightest see the battle. Pride means presumptuous arrogance. And naughtiness, we typically refer to naughtiness as something, when you dip somebody's pigtails in the ink well, perhaps. I didn't do that. We didn't have ink wells when I was in school, but we'd say, oh, you're being naughty, right? Well, naughty is a little bit more severe. It's the idea of moral badness, morally bad, to be wicked. So he's leveling some pretty hardcore accusations. You're an arrogant, stuck-up, immoral, wicked person. And you came down here that thou mightest see the battle. You're just an ambulance chaser, David. You came down here because you heard there's going to be a big fight. And you came down here to see the fight. Brat. Right? He didn't say that. It's in the Hebrew. David responds to this attack on his character because he has good reasons, right? He responds to this attack on his character in verse 29. And David said, What have I now done? Is there not a cause? Now this could be rephrased to how we speak more readily. For him to say, what did I say that was offensive? What have I now done? And then he says, is there not a cause? We would say, did that question, did my question not make sense in light of the situation? For David to say, Eliab, did you not hear the great big guy down there in the valley? The question I asked makes sense in light of what he's saying about you, the armies of Israel, and the God of Israel. Am I out of line here? Do you not hear what he's saying? Verse 30. And he turned from him, David turns from him toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. So David doesn't end his questioning because of Eliab's confrontation. Rather, he starts walking down the line, asking all the soldiers who are hiding behind rocks and trees, and he's asking them the same question that he asked in verse 26. So could you imagine this? You got a soldier. Let's big soldier. good soldier. He's hiding behind a rock. And here comes this little shepherd. And he taps him on the shoulder. He says, you know what happens to the guy who kills him? You're going to let him talk about your God like that? And David goes along to the next one, taps him on the helmet. Hey, you hear that guy? You're going to let him talk like that? And David's walking down the line from man to man, according to verse 30, and he's asking this question. Who's going to go stop this guy? We serve a much greater God than this big pagan down there. Verse 31. And when the words were heard which David spake, they rehearsed them before Saul, and he sent for it. Eventually, word makes it back to King Saul that there's a young man causing trouble down on the battle line. He's walking around and he's asking why nobody will go out and fight this Philistine. So Saul says, well, bring him here. Let's talk to this young man. And so Saul and David come again for what is their second, probably not their second meeting. They've probably spent more time together, but their second big occasion of being together. The first was when Saul had the evil spirit upon him. You remember? And he needed someone to play the harp so that the spirit would depart from him. And that someone who played the harp was David. So David and Saul are brought together. David wastes no time when he arrives before Saul in verse 32. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Him being the big guy down in the valley. Let no man's heart fail because of him. Thy servant will go and fight with this Philistine. This is the same faith that we saw in Saul's son, Jonathan. You remember in 1 Samuel 14, Jonathan was going up to fight against the Philistines. He took his armor bearer with him, and he said, there's no restraint to the Lord to save by many or by few. This is a recurrence of the same faith. I think this is this faith right here, faith in a greater cause, faith in a greater God, faith in God's ability to use large or small means is probably what drew David and Jonathan together to begin with. You know they're going to form a very close, dynamic friendship until Jonathan's death, and then beyond Jonathan's death, as David will care for his family. So this faith that David expresses echoes the faith of Jonathan, who had gone up and fought against the Philistines in 1 Samuel 14. David isn't comparing his size or battle experience to Goliath's, is he? Because Goliath has much more. He's looking at Goliath compared to his God. And David understands this isn't a fair fight, and it's not fair for him. This is not going to go well for Goliath because he's called out God. He's called out the creator of all that is. This isn't going to end well for him. And God can use me. Since everybody else is scared to go out there, I'll go because God isn't restrained to do this with many or to do this with few. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to see what God can do. Saul is looking at everything from the exact opposite perspective, though, because he says, through eyes of faithlessness and cowardice, in verse 33, he says, Saul said to David, thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. David, think what you're saying. Son, I don't want you to go out there and get killed. You better just stay here. Find a nice rock to hide behind. That's essentially what Saul's saying to him. Saul's looking at the size of Goliath. Remember, David's not looking at the man who towers over everyone else. He's looking at the God who is over all. And so David looks at this and he sees, so there's a giant. Doesn't matter. He's no match for my God. And Saul looks and he has minimized God in his view, and he's maximized the giant standing down in the valley. Now it is possible, as I was going through this, I had the thought, it's possible that in the back of David's mind, he's thinking back to an afternoon not that long ago when he was in his father's house in Bethlehem, surrounded by his brothers, as he knelt down and Samuel anointed him to be the next king of Israel. You think that was in David's mind right now? Those are not two separate events. That happened first, and now David is here. David, the anointed king of Israel, standing before the anointed, reigning king of Israel, and he is looking to go out. Perhaps he's thinking in his mind, well, God's got to start somewhere. Maybe this is what God will start with. God can use me. Do you think David was worried that Goliath would split him in half with his 12-pound spearhead? Probably not, for the same reason that Paul wasn't scared when he got bit by the snake. You remember? Paul got bit by the snake and he shook it off because God said, I got to go to Rome. And I'm a long way from Rome, so the snake can't kill me. And perhaps David's faith was even bolstered by the fact that he had been anointed to be king of Israel. And so now he's going to go forth. I know that God's going to do something because I haven't sat on the throne yet. And I will because God said so. Verse 34. And David said unto Saul, Thy servant kept his father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went out after him, and smote him, and delivered it out of his mouth. And when he rose against me, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. David's faith in God's enabling power is not without reason. God's done similar things before, hasn't he? He harkens back to a run-in with a lion and a bear. David would have had lots of different experiences as he was out on the trail, as it were, in the pasture. Although, as I was thinking about it, you see what he says there? How he killed the lion and the bear? It says he caught it by the beard. Where do you figure the beard on a lion or a bear is? Right where mine is. Okay. I've read through manuals. I've heard the little speech that they give you at some national parks. There is no situation in which you find yourself met with a bear when you should grab it by the chin. Okay? But that's exactly what David said. He says, why would a shepherd grab a bear by the chin?
Get a lamb out of its mouth.
Probably to get a lamb out of its mouth. David was used to putting the needs of others, sometimes other animals, in front of himself. He was a shepherd who was tasked with defending the flock. And that bear's got one of my sheep in its mouth. I need the bear's mouth open so that I can get the lamb out and then I'll kill it. So David he's not just talking out of school here. He says, look, God's used me to do some pretty amazing things before. I've killed a bear. I've killed a lion. Perhaps God will use me to do this now. Verse 36, Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God. Then we'll read the first part of verse 37. It says, David said, Moreover, the Lord hath delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear. He will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. Again, do you hear the echo from 1 Samuel 14 of Jonathan? God's not bound to deliver by many or by few. God could use the army, couldn't he? Or God could use one. God could use the biggest, strongest Israelite, or God could use me. God can use an experienced warrior or an experienced young shepherd. Verse 37, look at the last part of the verse. And Saul said unto David, Go, and the Lord be with thee. This is an interesting statement given what we know is going to develop in Saul and David's relationship over the years to come. Now, Saul didn't know that David is the one who's foretold in 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15:28, this is when Saul lost the kingdom. And Samuel said unto him, The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day, and hath given it to a neighbor of thine that is better than thou. The neighbor, of course, is David. And Saul doesn't know. I don't think there's no reason that we would assume that Saul knows the young man standing before him, volunteering to go out and fight Goliath, is his replacement. Okay? And so for Saul to say to David, Go, and the Lord be with thee is significant, I think. Saul doesn't know how the encounter he has just authorized will end up either. As far as Saul knows, he is sending this brave young man to what would very likely be a certain death. I'm going to send it. He's brave, and I admire that. He was a good guy. It's probably what Saul is thinking. He says, go, and the Lord be with thee. And Saul has an idea. He's going to offer his armor. Verse 38. And Saul armed David with his armor. And he put a helmet of brass upon his head, and also he armed him with a coat of mail. Who else wears a helmet of brass on his head and a coat of mail? Considerably larger, but nonetheless, a helmet of brass and a coat of mail. It's interesting that cowards will often be eager to help others do what they should have done themselves. Have you ever noticed that? That people who know what needs to be done, if they're not willing to do it, they're certainly willing to help you do it. And that's exactly what Saul's doing here. Again, Saul is head and shoulders above everyone. He's the king. He should have been the first one to say, I'll go fight Goliath. But he doesn't. I had one preacher of years gone by, and I don't remember his name. He said, if the armor was the way to go, why was Saul sitting on a stump? There's some truth to that question. If Saul had the armor, David shows up without armor, and Saul's all bent on getting him dressed up in his armor. Verse 39, David gives it a go. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go. That means he tried. Now, Saul was a big man, we know, and David was a youth. Okay? Saul is head and shoulders above everyone. David, not likely head and shoulders above everyone. He was the youngest of Jesse's sons. David tried to go, but it says, for he had not proved it. That just means he hadn't spent time with it. David hadn't gotten used to, your arm doesn't work the way your arm works when it doesn't have armor on when it does. And so, you ever try to move with all that weight? Well, David hadn't. He wasn't used to it, so he put them off. David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. He gave it a shot, gave it the old college try, and then decided this isn't the way to go. And again, was David counting on good armor? No. David, we know what he takes, right? He's going to take his staff, he's going to take a sling, and he's going to get 5 smooth stones out of the brook that runs through the bottom of the Valley of Elah. Okay? So David's going down there with weapons that he knows, but weapons that are wildly unmatched. Goliath has a spear with a 12-pound head on it. And he's got all this massive armor, and he's getting ready to go up against David, who has a piece of leather with 2 straps on it and a rock. It doesn't look evenly matched. But again, David's not looking at the size of Goliath. David is very firmly enchanted, if you will, through the eyes of faith by looking at the God who he serves. It's interesting because as all of this has transpired, from verse 24, everything that we've looked at tonight, from verse 24 to verse 39, Goliath has been standing down in the valley this whole time. He's been waiting. He came out to issue his challenge, and he's been standing out there waiting for Israel to send their champion. And next week, we're going to pick up with David selecting his weapons and going to meet the giant in the valley. If you look in verse 40, it says that he drew near to the giant, meaning they were both down there in the valley. Now, I have some questions for you, because this is a story that you're pretty familiar with. So let's get some application here real quick. Why did David want to fight Goliath? Was it because he wanted to marry Saul's daughter? Probably not. Was it to collect a bounty? Probably not. Was it to gain tax exemption for his family? Probably not. David went to fight Goliath because Goliath had defied the armies of the living God, and David took it personally. David, from what he said, David doesn't understand. What do you mean he's done this for 40 days? You've let this rascal get away with saying this about our God for over a month. There ought to be a line of guys waiting to get at him in the power of God, but they're all hiding behind rocks. And so David comes and he says, no, I'll go fight him because my God, our God, is much bigger than he is. And God's hand isn't bound to save by many or to save by few. The question should then, by way of application, do you stand up for the reputation of God? Do you allow others to run God down in your presence? You shouldn't. You should stand up. Be a man like this young boy was. Number one, why did David want to go to fight Goliath? Well, because Goliath had defied his God. Why did Eliab attempt to shame David with his questions? Well, I would make the case that likely he was embarrassed that his little brother was doing what he should have been doing. You think Eliab knew about God? Yeah. You think it probably went against Eliab's grain to hear Goliath run down his country and his God? Probably, but he chose to overlook it. And he hid with everybody else. Why wasn't David worried about going out to fight a highly trained warrior giant? Well, because David wasn't distracted by the giant. David was looking at God. David's confidence wasn't in his might. David didn't go look and he says, look, okay, his spear is this long, so I need one that's at least a foot longer. Nope. He doesn't say, he's got this much mail and this much protection, so I need at least that. Nope. David just goes out and he's going to fight in the power of God. He's going to go out and he's going to allow God to do something. My last question for you, by way of just applying this to us. Why was Saul hesitant to allow David to go fight Goliath? Well, because Saul was scared out of his mind. We've been told that several times. And so Saul is without the presence and the power of God. And he doesn't understand how this young man can be willing to do this. On his best day, Saul probably wasn't up to this. And here's a young man who is. Because he was scared like the rest of his men who had focused on the giant in the valley instead of the God in control. And that's what he should have been looking at. And you know, you've probably heard messages out of 1 Samuel 17 about the giants that we face. And we do. We face a lot of different issues. All of us, right now, we probably have issues. We have challenges. We have troubles. We have things on the horizon that we feel, but that's a big ask. And I would encourage you, like David did, don't allow yourself to get focused in on the giant. Don't allow yourself to get focused in on the issue. Don't allow yourself to get focused in on, this is going to be a rough week. This is going to be a rough period of time. No, don't look at that. Rather, step back just a little bit through the eyes of faith like David did. Everybody else, they've got the whole valley of Elah and the big blue sky and all of this, and what were they looking at? Goliath. And David, he hears Goliath down there in the valley, and what does he do? He looks up at the Lord and says, you hear this? You hear what he's saying about you? Lord, I'll go fight him. If you'll enable me, I'll go do it. Lord, you don't need an army. You don't need a big guy. I'm plenty big enough. You don't need me to have a sword and a spear and all this armor. Lord, I've got a sling. And we've used that before, you and I, in defeating lions and bears. So, Lord, let's do it again. And it changes everything when we get that perspective, doesn't it? When we can take our eyes off of the giant and get your eyes on your God. I would encourage you, as you face the troubles, the trials, the issues that you're going to face, maybe you've got some this week. Maybe you've got some that are on the calendar. Well, don't focus in on the giant. You should be aware of them. David didn't go out there and sling a stone in the wrong direction. He went out there and he used the skill that God had given to him. But it was all about God, and it wasn't about him. Keep your focus right and maintain that faith like David did. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Our Father, we thank you for the stories from the Old Testament especially that increase our faith. Lord, I pray that each and every one of us would be like David, that we would not allow ourselves to focus on the giant situations that we have, but Lord, rather that we would focus on our God, on you. I pray that you would use us, Lord, because as we've seen in chapter 14 and now in chapter 17, that your hand is not bound to save by many or by few. Lord, you can use us to do great things, and I pray that you would. I pray that we would make ourselves available to do so. And we'll give you the praise. In Jesus' name.